My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
This episode is brought to you by Loom by Atlassian. Are you feeling stuck at work? Get your team unstuck with Loom video messaging and move work forward. Use Loom to simultaneously record both your screen and yourself to share a quick update, provide feedback, train a colleague, and everything in between. Plus, add Loom AI to your meetings for instant written notes and recordings. Try Loom today at Loom.com. That's LOOM.com.
This episode is brought to you by GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco. Get the most out of your vehicle with GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco original equipment. The only parts designed, engineered, tested, and backed by General Motors. You can find your perfect fit for most makes and models and choose from 3 tiers of parts, including GM OE or gold and silver aftermarket parts. Visit gmparts.com for more information.
Is there a chance that Canada could break apart? I'm not sure we're at that point yet, but warning signs are on the horizon. You could say that the country's check engine light is flashing bright red. This time, the real problem isn't Quebec, it's Western Canada. Yes, Alberta, but more than just Alberta. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host, and today, a look at national unity from a Western perspective. We just had an election that returned a Liberal government, albeit with a new leader and Prime Minister at the helm. As Mark Carney will gladly and frequently tell you, he was born in the Northwest Territories, raised in Edmonton, Alberta. He loves showing off his Oilers jersey and views himself as a Westerner. But a desire to separate after this latest Liberal win has been on the rise. An Angus Reid poll taken before the election showed 30% in Alberta and 33% in Saskatchewan would want to make their province independent if the Carney Liberals won. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith recently introduced legislation to make it easier for citizen initiatives to take place, which could include a referendum on separation. We're at a crossroads. How we address these problems before us will determine the future of Canada. On this podcast, you will hear from my conversations with Premier Smith, with Dan Arnold, a Calgary native and Liberal, former senior staffer in the Trudeau PMO, and from Preston Manning about how we can address these issues, how we should address them. First up, Premier Smith, who I interviewed after the First Minister's meeting that took place last Wednesday, day after Prime Minister Carney went to Washington. I asked the Premier to explain for Canadians and the rest of the country while people in Western Canada, Alberta in particular, are feeling the way they do, neglected by the East.
Well, maybe the best way to describe it is for people to examine how scared and fearful they are that Donald Trump will crush their economy. That's how scared and fearful Albertans are that the Liberals will continue to crush our economy. All of the damage that we have seen over the last 10 years, most of it has come from bad federal policy coming out of the alliance between the Liberals and the NDs to target our industry and to put in punitive policies that are designed to keep our oil and gas in the ground. Maybe that's the best way to understand the feelings Albertans have right now. No, I'm feeling very hopeful. I think I've said before that I don't know if we've got conservative banker Mark Carney, who is our Prime Minister, or whether we've got a net zero advisory council to Justin Trudeau. Mark Carney is our Prime Minister. But I want to see which one that is. And I do think that if we can find a pragmatic path forward, then it's going to work for Canada and it's going to work for Alberta.
That's interesting that she spoke about Prime Minister Carney in a positive way. She hasn't been shy about being critical. And in fact, she was positive more than once during the interview about Carney, including telling me that when she presented him with her list of demands, he didn't say no right away.
What I will say is we've had a conversation, and I'm hoping to have many more, where I put those 9 issues on the table, and he didn't say no to any of them. Didn't say, yes, I'm going to address them all. But the fact that his first reaction was not no says to me that we have some common ground to start on. I've seen Doug Ford very vocally and in public talk about the importance of changing the regulatory process under C-69 so we can get things built. And that applies as much to Ring of Fire mining projects as it does to pipelines. I've been grateful to see that level of support from the chair of our Council of the Federation. And so I think he's getting the message from a number of different voices, not just mine, not just the energy industry, but also other premiers, that this is a rare moment where the nation is united. We realize the threat to our sovereignty that comes from the Americans because we haven't worked as well together in the past. And let's seize this moment to actually act like a nation and support each other. I think that is the very strong sentiment at the First Minister's table, and I think that he's getting that message from a lot of different viewpoints.
Let's admit off the top that the bar is pretty low following Justin Trudeau, but Premier Smith does appear optimistic. That's a good thing, I think. The premiers will meet with Prime Minister Carney at the beginning of June, not in Ottawa, as normally happens, but symbolically in Western Canada, in Saskatoon, June 1st and 2nd. We'll see at that point if Carney is still just mouthing nice words or if he's actually delivered something concrete or is moving in that direction at least. In addition to talking to Premier Smith, I wanted to get a Liberal perspective on Alberta. They are the party in charge federally after all, and there are Liberals in and from Western Canada. Dan Arnold, who goes by the handle Calgary Grit on X, is a proud Albertan and a proud Liberal. He spent several years running the polling for Justin Trudeau, including many of those years in the Prime Minister's office. I wanted his view on how the new Liberal government could handle this issue better. So, Dan, I'd like to get your thoughts on where we are right now. I don't think that we've got a Western separatist movement that is suddenly going to blow the barn doors off of Canada, but we have seen an increase in sentiment. We saw the Angus Reid poll that was out before the election showing that 33% of people in Saskatchewan would vote for their province to become independent if the Carney Liberals won. We saw the 30% in Alberta say the same thing. National unity is not just a Quebec issue anymore. If this is allowed to fester, we could end up in a pretty bad spot.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't think we're in a position where there's going to be a yes vote. It doesn't feel like the winning conditions are there, to take a phrase that Jacques Parizeau used to use. Quebec came very close to a yes vote, but that was on the heels of Meech and Charlottetown and a lot of unrest. Whereas, at this moment right now, we're kind of in a, Canada's all together against the U.S. and there's a bit of almost a nationalism boost that's happening right now, given everything that's going on south of the border. So, it doesn't feel like this is a moment where the conditions are there for a successful yes vote in Saskatchewan or Alberta. But it's fair to say that there's been a lot of resentment, a lot of frustration bubbling through the surface for a long time out west. Polaire does regular tracking on how Western Canadians feel about their place in the Federation. And support for separation is usually pretty low. It's usually around 20% when we poll on the question. But it's only about a third of Albertans who feel they're treated fairly by the federal government. So there is a sense that a lot of people feel like they're treated unfairly. And I think that creates a level of frustration. And if it gets stoked because of things the Premier is doing, because of referendums, because of what the federal government does or doesn't do, certainly that frustration could turn into something a lot more dramatic in the long run.
Some of my colleagues in the commentariat class are outright dismissive of this idea. Some have mocked it. I don't think that is the way to go. And I don't think, I'll say this up front, I don't think that is the attitude that Prime Minister Carney has taken. In fact, I think it's a bold move and an interesting one that he's decided to host the First Minister's meeting in Saskatoon. Instead of saying, all right, all you peasants come to Ottawa, he's going to them. I think that is a good move. But what are the steps, the overtures, the olive branches that this new government could extend to places like Alberta and Saskatchewan to try and turn things around, to lower the temperature? Yeah,
I lived in Alberta for many years. I've done a lot of research there. My sense is that the move for separatism there is not driven by a sense of necessarily unique culture or identity, the way that the move is in Quebec. It's more stemming from a sense of people feeling alienated, feeling like they're overlooked, like they're not listened to, maybe even treated somewhat as second class compared to people in other parts of the country. So I think the antidote to that is a first step is just listening, right, and spending time there, showing that you are taking people seriously, that you are listening to their concerns, which is why I think doing things like having a first minister's meeting out west is good. Certainly, Mark Carney, it sounds like his first call with Premier Smith was positive on both sides. I mean, she was still out the next 2 days later with her demands, but nevertheless, she did say the call was positive. So I think,
she was positive with me about the virtual first minister's meeting after the White House visit, and saying nice things about Mark Carney. I mean, it wasn't just Doug Ford; it was Danielle Smith as well.
So I think
surprising a lot of people.
The first step is listening, and I think Mark Carney seems to have that attitude right. He seems like he wants to listen. And look, he's from Alberta, which is an interesting dynamic as well too. I think in this situation, if Trudeau is prime minister, it would be harder to lower the temperature because the Trudeau name carries a lot of baggage with it. Whereas Carney is somebody who has lived in Edmonton for a long time. Seems like somebody who maybe is better positioned to show that understanding of Alberta, and maybe is the right person to lower the temperature at this moment.
Anything concrete other than in 2 months' time showing up in Calgary in jeans and a silly hat?
And I'm sure he'll wear the Oilers jersey a few times between now and then too, as the playoffs go along.
He is an Oilers fan. Absolutely, he's an Oilers fan. He's not just jumping on the bandwagon. I'll cheer for the Oilers until they're facing off against the Leafs in the Stanley Cup final.
Yeah, but beyond wardrobe that he's wearing, what can he do at this stage? I think. Look,
so is there a way to open things up on the oil and gas sector? I know he's been Mr. Net Zero in the past. He kind of gave conflicting messages to Western Canada and Quebec on that. But is there a way for him to make a move for the oil and gas sector without losing the progressive coalition that helped him win the election?
Well, I mean, that's the great challenge that all prime ministers face, is those regional divisions, and nowhere is that division more apparent than when it gets to issues around environment and the energy sector. I think in most issues, when you ask about healthcare, people don't feel that differently in Alberta from Quebec. When you ask about housing and cost of living, it's easy to get consensus. It's less easier to get consensus on some of these other files. Where there does seem to be some opening is where Carney's talked about energy corridors and helping resources get to market. He's certainly not anti-development. He's not a keep the oil in the ground type of guy from comments he's made before. So I think there'll be some openness there, but I think if we're being honest about it, if you look at the full list of demands that Danielle Smith put on the table, he's not going to agree to all those things there. He's not going to repeal the clean energy regulations. He's not going to move away from some of the net zero mandates. So, she's never going to get everything she wants, but I suspect there'll be some areas where Carney might, from his kind of pro-business perspective, do some things that she might be happy about and might help lower the temperature a little bit.
The one thing that I've been hearing from several premiers that I've spoken to on the record and off is that it is a very different tone. The meetings don't begin with a lecture from the Prime Minister anymore. They begin with listening. And so even politicians that had a good relationship with Prime Minister Trudeau when he was in office just feel better about the meetings now. So that is a good thing. You do a lot of deep dives, and your X feed was fantastic post-election for trying to figure out a bit of where things had moved. For a little while, it looked like the Liberals, there was talk they could take 5. I heard some people mistakenly say, they could get as many as 9 seats in Alberta. I always thought that was crazy. They did take 1 in Saskatchewan that they didn't hold previously, but they were kept to 2 in Alberta. Did you do any deep dive into how close they were to taking more seats in that province? Because with the expansion, with more urban seats, there is that potential. Did they come close at all, or was that just pipe dreaming that the people were engaged in prior to the vote?
So the Liberal vote share went up a lot in both Saskatchewan and Alberta. And, one of the things I did to comment on was the ridings where the Liberals had their biggest gains from 2021 to 2025. I think 3 of the top 5 were in Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan University, Regina Louvain were up there. So, the Liberals, they took a big step forward. They got a lot more votes this election in both provinces than they did before. It just didn't really translate to seats at the end of the day. I think they probably would have needed another 5 or 10 points of support to actually turn that into seats. The challenge is really they just kind of ate up the NDP vote in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and they actually need to convert some of those Conservative voters into their side to actually have a chance to win more seats there.
Kind of the reverse of the Conservatives in Ontario.
Yeah, with the collapse of the PPC, but other votes don't go there. So yeah, I think the Liberal brand feels less toxic as a brand now than it did a couple of years ago. Just if you look at the share of the popular vote, even if it didn't turn into seats, and maybe that helps Carney a little bit. He's not, his personal brand numbers, if you ask, are you favorable or unfavorable towards Mark Carney, aren't terrible in Alberta right now, and that could obviously change in a couple of years. But I think he goes into it as not the big bad in Ottawa, which is often the case, and it's harder for Danielle Smith to kind of hold him up as this villain in the story, at least until he does something that maybe looks villainous, right? People are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, even if they didn't vote for him. And I think that augurs well for perhaps maybe having some ability to work together on some files between, Carney and Moe and Smith.
Well, as I said in my column in the Toronto Sun just a little while ago, he's making the right noises. By the time the First Minister's meeting happens at the beginning of June, we'll know whether those noises are just noise or moving in a serious policy direction.
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, the first step is it's symbolism. It is listening. The biggest frustration point people have is they don't feel listened to often in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So I think listening is actually a tangible thing to do. We'll see what happens with cabinet appointments. If there is a representative from Alberta or Saskatchewan in cabinet, that could also give another voice that could speak with a bit more authority on these issues. But yeah, eventually it's going to be more about, actually outcomes as opposed to conversations. And, that's where I think there will be more difficulty because, he's not going to do everything Danielle Smith wants to do. A lot of the things she wants to do just are not broadly supported by people nationally. So it's going to be hard for Carney to go along with everything. But I would be hopeful there'll be some areas where he can make some moves that will be well received in Alberta. And hopefully that lowers the temperature to the point where there isn't actually a referendum. Because I think the actual nature of having a referendum would really heat this issue up even further. It may not pass, but it would be a very potentially divisive moment in Alberta and nationally if it got to that point.
All right, Dan Arnold, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Finally, Preston Manning, the force behind the Reform Party, which went from a protest movement to a fringe political party to the official opposition in short order in the 1990s. He's still politically involved, he's still concerned about Western Canada and how they're being treated, and he has some thoughts on what should happen next. Well, Mr. Manning, you popularized the phrase "the West wants in" when you were leading Reform Party a long time ago. Is that still what's going on, or does the West want out now?
Well, I think that question is being raised. I don't think it's been answered yet, but there's a lot of unrest in Western Canada, mainly produced by the 9 years of what Westerners would consider liberal misrule. And that unrest is not confined, of course, to Alberta. It's across the West, and there's unrest in Quebec as well. So the country has a unity challenge.
Many people have said that national unity is one of the main primary jobs of any prime minister. I don't think that Justin Trudeau took it very seriously. He allowed Western alienation to fester. By the end of his time in office, the threat of Quebec separatism and the rise of the Parti Québécois had come back. The Bloc Québécois was a major force after being reduced to just a handful of seats by Stephen Harper in 2011. Justin Trudeau just did not seem to care. And in fact, I would argue that in the 2021 election, he campaigned against Alberta to win seats in BC and Ontario.
Yeah, he was not conducive to national unity. I think any prime minister to be able to achieve some genuine unity needs to almost formally recognize the regional character of Canada. Canada is a huge country, and it's in regions: Atlantic, Laurentian, Prairie, Pacific, the North. And what would be very helpful is a prime minister who recognizes that each of those regions has distinctive, to use the Quebec word, aspirations and concerns which have to be dealt with and acknowledged. And Liberal administrations have done that to some extent with respect to Atlantic Canada. Laurentian Canada has ignored the Prairie region, the BC region, the Pacific Coast region, and the North. And it's to be seen whether a new government has any better recognition of the aspirations and concerns of those regions. I hope so. I hope so.
Some of the Laurentian elite, to use a well-known term, have been highly critical of you and your thoughts surrounding this during the course of the election, accusing you of, fomenting separation, fomenting the breakup of the country. Is that what you're trying to do, or what is it that you're trying to do?
No, of course not, Brian. And they don't know what my positions are. Give me the name of one of those elites that had actually called me and asked what my positions were. Not a single one. What they do know is a bit indirectly from the media. One of the things I'm trying to do is, and whether this comes about is still a question, is to create what we're calling a Canada West Assembly, where you'd get people from the 4 western provinces and the territories together, and then invite these different groups that have perspectives on what the West should be doing in the future to make formal representation, to be subject to cross-examination like you should be in a democratic forum, to listen to the positions of others, and then take a straw vote at the end and make some recommendations to the provincial governments. And those options that will be considered will be everything from the status quo to the status quo modified by the demands of the western provinces, modified perhaps by what the new federal government says, and will include these options for secession in various forms so that you get them out of the back rooms and get them into a democratic arena where they're tested. Now, that's the democratic way to deal with unrest, and I would say that's more conducive to unifying the country than denying that these concerns or aspirations exist.
I think that's part of the problem, is that far too many people do just want to deny that these problems exist, or that it's just, you guys out west, you just hate liberals, and you can't take liberals winning, and that's why you want to take your ball and go home. I've spoken to people who have voted for all the parties in the prairies over the years, over their lifetimes. And, when you talk to them, you find out that many of them, now they're voting for conservatives or conservative-leaning parties, but they didn't start out that way. And part of the reason that they're doing that is they feel that's the only party willing to listen to what the concerns of farmers or ranchers or people in the natural resource industry in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, or Alberta, that, the other guys are just dismissive. They look past them. It's flyover country to them.
Yeah, it's a worry to me, Brian, the apparent utter indifference of not just the parties, but of the voters in central Canada to these concerns in Western Canada, where you have an industry, particularly the natural resource industry, that is carrying a lot of the freight to the Canadian economy and generating a lot of the revenue for that federal government that is redistributed other places. And a sign that the next parliament and the next government is acknowledging these concerns, one of the big ones would be an act to reduce the intrusiveness of the federal government in the natural resources sector. That's one of the biggest sources of frustration.
Does that? I read your comments on that. Does it actually need to be a piece of legislation? Does it need to be an act? Or does it just need to be that the federal government starts respecting the Constitution, the division of powers?
Well, you could say that. You could put it that way, yes. But it's what do they do? They can say they're going to respect the Constitution, but a sign that they're doing so would their federal government's intrusion in areas of provincial responsibility is done through statutes that authorize the intrusion in the health field by the Health Act, in the resources sector by the Impact Assessment Act by Bill C-69, in the municipal affairs, which is exclusively a provincial responsibility, through the legislation that establishes the Canada Mortgage Bank, and
most recently the Housing Accelerator Fund.
Yeah. And if the federal government wanted to send a signal that it's prepared to withdraw from those areas, that would do a lot to heal relationships, not just with Alberta and the Prairie provinces. The federal government's got to fight with almost every provincial government. Federal-provincial relations are in a shambles, partly thanks to Trudeau. And one way to fix that is to withdraw from those areas. And people will be watching the throne speech to see not just whether there's nice words, not just whether someone comes out of a press conference and says we're going to do something. Your Parliament is a place that makes or unmakes laws. So let's make the law that corrects some of these worries.
You mentioned that they've got to fight with every provincial government. While Alberta has taken the lead in being critical of Bill C-69, every provincial government, New Democrat, Liberal, Conservative-leaning, joined in that fight. They joined the court reference case to try and have that law struck down, because it's while it's dubbed the No More Pipelines bill, it's getting in the way of the Ring of Fire in Ontario. It's getting in the way of mining operations in British Columbia, which is still led by an NDP government. There isn't a provincial government that isn't affected by this.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that would be helpful, Brian, is this country is the second largest country by landmass in the world, that therefore has either the largest or the second largest stock of natural resources: agriculture, energy, mining, forestry, and the fishery. And we need a federal government that recognizes those sectors as fundamental building blocks of the Canadian economy and any economic recovery. And Trudeau particularly treated them as relics from the past, or even environmental liabilities. And when you talk about those sectors to urban voters, some of them, when you mention agriculture, they think, well, that's cows in the field and grain. No. The agriculture producing sector's at the bottom. There's an agriculture manufacturing sector on top of that. There's an agricultural service sector on top of that. There's an agricultural knowledge sector on top of that. And there's a pyramid like that on top of every one of those resource sectors. And 90% of those other jobs, manufacturing, processing, and the knowledge sector, are in urban centers. So that virtually every Canadian has a vested interest in the health and development of those sectors. And when you have a federal government that denies that, ignores that, and even gets in the way of those developments, that's what's crippled the Canadian economy, reduced our GDP to where it is.
Well, they look upon it as if we are pursuing those industries, then we're still just being drawers of water and hewers of wood, and that isn't what we should be doing.
That is a 100-year-old fallacy. How can you say that when has anybody looked at the manufacturing sectors that are on top of those resource sectors? Did anybody look at the service sectors that are on top of those, which employ more people than down below? The knowledge sectors? How can anyone still adhere to that view? And if they do, they ought not to have any business in the Parliament of Canada. Well,
I don't know how many years I spent listening to people, even politicians dismissing the manufacturing sector, which we've got a premier in Ontario now that champions it. And, but for the longest time it was, we need to focus on the knowledge economy. And, we learn to code, buzz phrases like that. They didn't care about manufacturing. They didn't care about resources. They didn't care about ag. I mean, that's something done out in the country somewhere, right? That's where the stuff that happens on my drive to the cottage, maybe.
Well, that's if those views prevail, that's why the Canadian economy will will malfunction. And it's the neglect, not just the neglect of those sectors by the federal government, but the putting obstruction in the way of their development that is causing a great deal of this frustration in Western Canada. And the different responses are the premiers, particularly Premier Smith and Premier Moe of Saskatchewan, have put out a list of things that if the federal government would do those, it would alleviate some of this unrest in the West.
So when I spoke to Premier Smith the other day, she said that she put forward her 9 proposals and Prime Minister Carney didn't say no to any of them, but he didn't say yes. Does she need to get all of her demands met? Does Premier Moe need to get all of his demands met? Or are there simple things that this new government can do to extend an olive branch and show, yes, we understand, yes, we're going to move on this, we won't give you everything, but we're going to make some moves?
But Brian, they have to do something.
And that's what I'm asking. What could they do to extend that olive branch?
Well, introduce legislation or orders in council to eliminate those barriers that are frustrating Westerners. But do it. Not just talk about it in speeches, come out of meetings and say these things to the media. Go and do it. If you're a member of the Parliament of Canada, I used to be one, you make laws. You're the only ones, in fact, in the country that can make federal law. So go and do it. And if it's your laws that are the obstructions, as the Impact Assessment Act is, as Bill 69 is, then either repeal them or amend them to reduce the intrusiveness. And I think what's making Westerners increasingly impatient is to talk about these things, to say we're going to do things, promise things, but no action on them. And that would be the simplest thing the federal government can do. And the options that Westerners will be looked at, one is whether these conditions that Premier Smith, and I'm a great supporter of what she's doing, whether there's a response from the federal government, whether the federal government itself takes some initiative on these areas, which maybe will be in the throne speech. I don't know. People will be watching. But if there's nothing there, you're going to see an increase in this desire to maybe the West should be more independent from the Federation than it is now. And you've got this same frustration in Quebec on a different set of issues.
Well, we've got some polling that I'd like to ask you about when we come back. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to ask you about how seriously other Canadians are taking it and whether people who are talking about independence are playing with fire. Back in moments.
Jif peanut butter. It's that jiffing good, it doesn't really need advertising. So instead, enjoy the calming sounds of the ocean. It's that jiffing good. Get your Jif at jif.com.
Ladies, you'll end up shopping for your guy's deodorant, right? So try Degree's Original Cool Rush. You see, last year, Degree changed the formula, and men were mad. One guy even started a petition. So Degree admitted they messed up and brought the Original Cool Rush scent back. It's clean, crisp, and actually smells like someone you want to cuddle. And it's in Walmart, Target, and other stores now for under $4. So toss one in your cart and find out why it's the best-selling men's antiperspirant for the last decade. Degree Cool Rush is back, and it smells like victory.
This episode is brought to you by Principles. Are there limits to the U.S. government's debt growth? What will happen if the debts are not curtailed? What should policymakers or investors do? Those are urgent questions that legendary investor and New York Times bestselling author Ray Dalio addresses in his new book, How Countries Go Broke: The Big Cycle. The book comes out in June and is available for pre-order today, wherever books are sold.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
New polling published in National Post for the Association of Canadian Studies shows that 52% of Canadians do actually believe that Western separation is an issue to be taken seriously. Mr. Manning, you're talking about this Citizens' Assembly. How would that differ from the Alberta Next panel that Premier Smith is putting together?
Well, for one thing, if this assembly comes about, it would be a pan-Western assembly, not just Alberta, because these sentiments exist in Saskatchewan, in a lot of rural Manitoba, and eastern, central, and northern British Columbia. So this assembly, if it occurs, would be a pan-Western, not just Alberta. And this is an important thing, I think, for people in central Canada to understand. Although Alberta gets a lot of the publicity, these sentiments are a lot broader than Alberta. So this would be pan-Western assembly. And basically, it would be just an opportunity for the proponents of the major options featuring that the West is considering to be presented, cross-examined, debated, and votes taken. Which of these ought to be, if any, recommended to the provincial government. So the panel that Premier Smith is talking about would, of course, be welcome to make one of these presentations. This is what they found with respect to Alberta. There would be similar presentations maybe from the other provinces. And the idea would be to get these people that are talking about secession and have not thought it through in many cases, or exactly what that means. Let that get out of the back rooms onto a democratic forum, cross-examined, and looked at the practicalities and the pluses and the minuses doing that. And hopefully this would provide a democratic way of dealing with these frustrations and leading to recommendations that would be useful to the provincial governments.
But are you playing with fire a little bit on this issue? If you start platforming people that do want to break up the country, if you're putting forward a forum for them to explain why the country should be broken up. I know there's different factions.
You're playing with fire if you suppress them. You're playing with fire if you suppress them. And why the double standard? Why is it okay to have these open debates in Quebec and to have them for 20 years? Why is that okay? Why is that legitimate? But if Western Canada even considers that this is some illegitimate practice, the West simply doesn't buy that. And my fear is if you try to suppress these more radical views and keep them in the back room and say, despite the fact that we're a democracy where there's freedom of expression, you can't do that here. That causes internal combustion that is more dangerous than exposing these things.
I'm watching the different factions, primarily from Alberta, talk about this, although I do recall interviewing the people from the Maverick Party, or what was the Wexit Party that became Maverick, and some of their main organizers were originally from Saskatchewan. But in Alberta, it's getting a lot of the attention. There are different factions even within the independence movement. There are those who want what Quebec once described as sovereignty association, more independence, but still part of Canada. There are people arguing that Alberta should just become its own independent country. And then there are others, and I think this might be the smallest group, but things can change and grow, is the group that wants to join the United States. What would you say to those who, because I believe that you still believe in a united Canada, what would your argument be to those in the groups that either want to make Alberta independent or to join the United States?
Well, I'd say get your act together, first of all. There's about 10 of these groups in Alberta and maybe 4 in Saskatchewan. Get your act together so there's a couple of major presentations of your postures. The main one would be to secede to create an independent country. The second one might be to secede with the aim of joining the United States. Get that proposal as refined and thought through as you can, and then make a presentation of that to this assembly. And I say to those people, and I have said it to some of those people, you'll get a chance to have your say, and you won't be pushed in the back room and say, we can't talk about that here. But your proposal would be subjected to cross-examination by people who know a lot about this subject.
Well, you know a lot about the subject, so What would your cross-examination be for arguing in favor of a united Canada?
Well, the cross-examination wouldn't be to argue in favor or against. It would be expose the pros and the cons of both sides so that the people in this assembly can make a judgment on it. It's what Jefferson called informing the discretion, which is an interesting phrase. It doesn't mean telling people what to do. It says give them the tools and the information so they can make a right decision. And, if you had cross-examination of these options, one of the issues that come up is how access to seaboard if you're independent. if it's okay, it's BC and Manitoba's engaged, but if they're not, what about that? What about the status of Indigenous people who have treaty arrangements with the federal government? We ran into this. I was in Ottawa in 1995 when the Quebec referendum was posited, and we had Northern Cree come and sit in our office and say, we don't care what these people in Quebec vote, we are going to be part of Canada, and the federal government is responsible for us. There's all those types of issues. And the important thing is to get cross-examined and get the pros and the cons out. And those will not be the major issue. They'll be our major proposals at this assembly. I would assume the major ones are the position that Premier Smith and Premier Moe has taken. Here's a list of conditions that if the federal government met them, the West would feel more at home in the Federation. Are they or are they not being met? There may be some initiatives come from the federal government, the new government in the throne speech. So if there is, that might be a sort of a second set of options. So the idea is to have a democratic discussion of these options, and there's not very many places today where you can have them. You certainly can't have them in the Parliament of Canada.
Which is sad and ironic.
Which is ironic, I know. Ironic.
So when you were starting reform, the grievances were different. But the fact that so many in Western Canada feel like their voices are silenced, that they don't have the political muscle that should match their importance to the country economically and otherwise, those remain. Is it possible to even deal with somebody? You wrote into Ottawa, wanting a triple E Senate. Prime Minister Harper tried valiantly to change the Senate in a few different ways and was stymied at every turn. The Supreme Court has effectively said, you're not going to change this. Don't even bother. So how do you address those non-economic terms, like the political muscle? How many senators do you have in the West?
Fewer than 24, but
that's fewer than all Atlantic Canada has.
One of the problems will come up is to the extent that the proposed reforms by any of these groups involve constitutional change. It brings up the issue that the Canadian Constitution is virtually unamendable because of the formula. You can't amend it. And so your fallback position is to try to achieve some of these things without amending the Constitution. For example, if in the federal parliament there was free voting, if this new government, tell Carney I could write this out for him and he could say it in 20 seconds. If the new government got up and said, we will not resign unless we lose a specific non-confidence motion. We will not resign because some bill gets defeated. We won't resign because some section of some motion gets defeated. We'll only resign if there is a explicit measure of non-confidence to defeat us.
With the traditional money bill being part of that.
No, I wouldn't even include that.
You wouldn't even do that?
No, but then say to the members that you've got freer voting. If there's some Liberal members from Western Canada who disagrees with what the government is doing, they ought to be able to get up and say so and vote against it without toppling the government. That's what the amending the Confidence Convention and providing freedom of voting, it would provide at least some effective regional representation in the House of Commons if you can't get it in the Senate. Now this is it's not the best way to do it, but if you can't amend the Constitution, at least it's one way to do it.
Could you add more senators for the Western provinces without amending the Constitution?
Well, you could add senators, but I think they have to be democratically accountable. These senators are not accountable to anybody, except the person that appointed them. What's a body like that having anything to do with the making of federal law? If Canada was asked to take a look at the constitutional arrangement in some third world country, and they had a block in their lawmaking process where there was completely unelected and unaccountable people had something to do with the passage of the laws, we would say that's undemocratic. Mm-hmm. But we have it like that.
Well, we have it, and we are seemingly stuck with it, much to my chagrin.
Well, one of the other things that I've heard, although I don't like the prospect of it, if Quebec were to decide to leave the Federation, that would blow the Constitution apart. You would have to have a constitutional convention to completely rewrite the Constitution of Canada. And, the West would argue, well, give us the 3 seats that Quebec had on the Supreme Court, give us the 24 seats they got in the Senate, give us a big chunk of the 75 seats in the House of Commons, and we'd probably be quite happy.
I don't like that prospect either, though.
Yes, that's a way out one there. But it's ironic that the only way we could force a major rethinking of our Constitution is for somebody to blow it apart. Like that, what kind of a system is that?
What are the other issues beyond the economics, beyond the Senate and Democratic issues that you are hearing about as you talk to people about the grievances from Western Canada?
Well, one of them is that, as you know, the West looks west to the Asia-Pacific region as where a lot of the future is going to happen. And there were Westerners that noticed the first place that Mr. Carney went was to France and England, back to the old countries. He mentions ties with the European Union. He mentions that 10 times to every. I haven't even heard him talk about Australia, Japan, and how to handle China. So there's a fundamental difference with West tends to, and particularly the younger people. Some of our younger people, when they get out of university and they want to go traveling internationally, they go west. They do not go necessarily to Europe. So and this affects our foreign affairs. What emphasis is going to be made on the Asia Pacific and the 21st century Asia Pacific rather than improving our ties to the past?
Is it wise to still hitch our wagon to China?
No one's suggesting that, but you can't ignore them. And having discussions with the Australians as to how do you maintain an independence from China and on the security front, but you have to recognize what a big economic player they are. It would be very healthy for Canada to do that.
All right. Mr. Manning, thanks for your time. Do keep in touch. We'll watch the Western Assembly if it comes together. We'll see how the people in Western Canada continue to react to the Carney government. As you said earlier, it's going to be actions and not words. And hopefully by the time he meets the premiers in Saskatoon, we're on the way to seeing what those actions, if any, will be. Thanks so much.
Okay, so let's stay tuned, you're saying.
Yes. Full Comment is a Post Media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libben is the executive producer. Remember to hit subscribe on Apple, Spotify, wherever you're listening to your podcast. Leave us a rating and give us a review. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I promised you.
So, although abortion was sort of accessible, it really wasn't.
But then 1988 rolls around. And what's the law on abortion then? Suddenly, there wasn't one. Literally no restrictions existed in 1988. Abortion went from heavily restricted to completely unrestricted almost overnight. There was no referendum on this. There wasn't even an act of parliament. This whole thing is due to a somewhat surprise decision out of the Supreme Court of Canada. And it came about in large part because of one man, a Canadian doctor who had been relentless about running illegal abortion clinics since the 1960s and was determined to overturn the laws prohibiting the practice. Along the way, he endured multiple arrests, constant raids, a jail term, a firebombing of his clinic, an attack by a fanatic wielding garden shears, the approbation of virtually his entire profession, and frequent death threats. If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.